Hi, welcome back to Chicano Theater 103d, the beginning of the Chicano theater movement. Today, we're going to continue on into the development and growth of the Chicano theater movement and El Teatro Campesino by examining the mito, bringing the spiritual past into the present, but in kind of a metaphorical way. We're going to go back and remember the past to move forward into the present and then the future. What do I mean by that? A little bit of scaffolding. What do I mean by that? A little review of what we've talked about to get us to where we are today. To begin, a little review of how we got here. Here to talk about the mito. So we talked previously about the first two actos of Chicano theater, Las dos caras del patroncito and La quinta temporada, two very simple actos or skits. They used elements of Comedia del Arte, Mexican popular theater, Brecht's idea of the learning play, very physical, short, comic, direct, addressed to the audience with one primary action in mind. To get those watching, primarily farm workers at the Delano grape strike, to join the union and support the strike. Very clear, very easy, first two. The next three we talked about, 2 years later, start to expand a little bit this growth of Chicano theater. Los Vendidos, No saco nada de la escuela, I don't get anything from school, and Soldado Raso, or Buck Private. How are they different? How did this growth continue? How was Chicano theater and El Teatro Campesino developing? The plays were longer, had a little broader focus. By that I mean the first two plays, actos, were very much focused on one thing, the strike, the campesinos, getting them to support the United Farm Workers Union. Now, in Los Vendidos, we start to talk about identity, how Chicanos are perceived by the other. So we see these images, these stereotypical images of different representations of Mexicans and Chicanos. Are they laughing at the stereotypes? Or are they laughing at the way those stereotypes are created and perceived by the other non-Latino, non-Chicano world? You can decide that for yourself. Second play, No saco nada de la escuela. I don't get anything out of school. Starts to broaden up even more. They're talking now about school, about education. It even has a different, bigger timeline. The plays we read previous to this play all took place in kind of a Greek theater sense of unity of time, all happening in the same amount of time it took to tell the story. In this one, we go through 3 different time periods, from elementary school to high school to college. So it starts getting a little deeper. There are more characters. The characters are not only Chicanos. We have an African-American character who, as he's described and mentioned in the stage directions, is a little outdated. We can say that honestly. We can say that nowadays it might seem problematic. Probably it is. Can we just say, yes, how he's described and maybe portrayed a little bit might be a little, not even archetypal, maybe a little stereotypical. In 1965, it wasn't. Still, there's that character. And then we have the 2 characters of the 2 white children. So we're starting to get a little broader view of the society that the Chicano students live in, and they work their way towards college, grow and develop, and then decide what are they going to do with their education. The last one goes from college directly to the urban barrio, Soldado Raso, a political look at Chicanos going to the Vietnam War and how they perceive the war once they're there, and the kind of message some of them might be sending back home. This play is a little more directly political, not that the early actos weren't, but this play is a little more directly political about what's happening in a much bigger form. which is not only the Barrio, not only the U.S. and the war, the protests against the war in Vietnam, but also about the perception of the war on the global plane. So these three plays continue to lead to the growth, the expansion of the themes of Chicano theater, and the themes also affect the form, how they're presented. So we have different characters. We have a bit of a mythological character. I guess you could say in La Quinta Temporada, there were characters that were a bit mythological in terms of the 4 seasons and then the allegorical 5th season of social justice. But in Soldado Raso, we have a character that becomes very familiar to audiences and performers in Chicano theater, La Muerte, death. Death is both a narrator of this play and also steps in and out. So the theatrical use of death is becoming a little deeper, a little more theatrical. So Luis and his Teatro Campesino are starting to have a little more knowledge, a little better use of theatrical devices, and that's very prevalent in La Muerte. So we see how Chicano theater and El Teatro Campesino continue to grow and develop, which brings us to what we're going to talk to today. We started talking about this last week. We'll go a little deeper. The mito. The word itself kind of tells you what it's going to be about. A myth, a Chicano myth. Where does this basis for Chicano myths come from? And then the representation of these Chicano myths in Chicano theater. We spoke earlier, not only in terms of when we were discussing what is a Chicano, but when we talked about the beginning of mitos, we talked about the mito of Aztlan, the mythical northern homeland that the Mexica, Azteca, Nahuatl came down searching for their mythical homeland, an island in the middle of a lake with the serpent on a cactus, and there founded their great city, the heart of their empire, Tenochtitlan. So mythology is very important in Aztec Mexica history and also in Chicano Latino history and culture and heritage. So we have the mito, spiritual stories. As we said earlier, acto, seen through the eyes of man, mito, stories, seen through the eyes of God or gods. The first play we're going to talk about today is The Dark Root of a Scream, based on both Nahuatl Azteca mythology and Chicano reality. The Dark Root of a Scream, written in 1967, only 2 years from the founding of Teatro Campesino in 1965, first performed in a church in Fresno. It's interesting. I hope you've all read the play. It's interesting that this play is performed for its first time in a church. Is that happenstance? Is that serendipitous? Or is it divine intervention and inspiration? But we know that it was performed in a church. This play that deals so heavily with religious, mythological knowledge and facts of the Aztec and Mexica being performed in the Roman Catholic Church in California in 1967. So what do we have in this? And how is it different from most American plays, these mitos of the 60s and early 70s? How is it different from the actos? Well, we know this. We know, as we've said, the actos were getting a little more profound with No Saco Nada and the other plays that we talked about from the early actos. But this one now starts to become a little more mystical, a little more, can we say, magic and real? Can we say that Latin American literature trope of magic realism? I would say we probably could. So these plays have a bit of, they're centered in a Chicano reality, but there is not an intrusion of mysticism, but an overlay, a blending of Chicano reality and their mythic Aztec past. Interesting. So, what do we know about this? Eyes of God. And who were the gods? Aztec gods. And who were the characters? Well, we have a priest. We have Dalia, the girlfriend of Indio, the dead Chicano soldier, former activist, who goes to Vietnam. Why does he go to Vietnam? They talk about that in the play. He was an activist. Why did he not avoid the draft? Is it perhaps that Chicano macho theme of not wanting to seem less than brave, of wanting to prove himself as a real American? I don't know. What do you think? Why doesn't Indio just not go to Vietnam? It was happening a lot. It was happening with people going to Canada or people hiding. Mostly that happened with middle-class college students, mostly Anglo-American. I don't know of a lot of Chicanos, and I know a lot of Chicanos in my family as well as in the area that I grew up who were drafted. I don't know any that didn't go. Anyway, careful, professor, get off that soapbox. So he goes to Vietnam. We have Johnny. I'm sorry, Johnny's in Soldado Raso. We have Indio. And that's interesting. I mentioned that Freudian slip. Freud would say there are no mistakes. How are Johnny in Soldado Raso and Indio in The Dark Root of a Scream related? And how are they different? Well, one of them is an activist. The other one is not. However, they both seem to have some kind of an awakening while in Vietnam. In Soldado Raso, we see that in the letter that Johnny writes home to his mother, and which his mother answers. In Dark Root of a Scream, Indio has that waking up before he even goes to Vietnam. He's already talking about Aztec mythology, Aztec figures before he goes to Vietnam, as he's talking about community building, consciousness raising, which was also happening, as we know, in the Chicano movement and in El Teatro Campesino. So he's already having this conscious raising, but something in him still compels him, for whatever reasons, right or wrong, to go to Vietnam. Does he continue to raise his consciousness in Vietnam? What happens to him there? We don't really know. There are no given circumstances of him doing that in Vietnam, but the given circumstances are these. He dies, and what happens to him when he comes back to his body? I'll get to that in a minute. So we have Indio, we have his girlfriend Dalia, and we have the priest, and we have the mother. Three characters and one that is talked about. The priest, Dalia, the mother, and Indio, who is just talked about. Realistic characters. There's still, of course, a little bit of an archetype in the noble girlfriend, grieving widow. There is the mother who is very related, but a little more mystical to the mother in Soldado Raso. And then there is the priest who seems to want to help, but a bit stereotypical, not understanding, and not really being able to understand the grief and where the mother and the girlfriend are, Dalia, because he doesn't understand the Chicano wanting to explore his roots and wanting to be active, wanting to support the community and get involved in the community conscious raising activism. They talk about that in the play. But then there are the other three characters. Who are those three characters? Lizard, conejo, rabbit, gato, cat. Yes, you could say it's a very Chicano trope. It was when I was growing up to have young Chicanos be nicknamed. In my barrio, there was someone nicknamed Venado, deer, because he had big, soulful eyes. There was another character named Sapo, because he was kind of squat. Sapo meaning toad or frog. And then everyone else had a nickname. I had a nickname. I'm not going to tell you what it is. So we have these three characters, but they're named with non-human nicknames. Lizard, rabbit, cat. So these names are significant. They're animals. How is that related to the mythology of the Aztecs? Aztec mythology was very related to the animal world. In fact, in the Aztec culture, Nahuatl culture, it's not a man on the moon, but even though the moon is represented by an Aztec god, which is anthropomorphic meaning related to or presented in a kind of a human way, something that Walt Disney characters do very much so. Anyway, the moon is not a man in the moon. There is the myth of that what we see as a man in the moon in Aztec literature is a rabbit. And if you look at it, it does look like the profile of a rabbit, the man in the moon. One of the early Aztec myths says that there were two suns, they were too bright, too hot, so one of the gods got a rabbit and threw it up at the moon where it landed and got stuck, and that made the moon a little less bright because of the rabbit in it, and so it became less bright, less hot than the sun. So that's how we got the sun and the moon. So rabbit. Then we have lizard. Well, lizards and snakes are very important in Aztec mythology. When the Spanish came, they brought with them their Christian mythology of the devil, later to be called Lucifer, the serpent in the Garden of Eden. The Aztecs were a little surprised and confused because to them, serpent were holy and godlike. Not only the serpent in the beak of the eagle, which is a representation of where they were going to settle, which is also still shown today on the Mexican flag. Eagle, serpent, cactus, very Mexican symbology on the Mexican flag. So there is the lizard, the serpent, very important in mythology. So why are these characters named that? Why not caballo? No, because caballos were not in the New World as far as we know before the conquistadors, the Spaniards came. So these three animals that would have been known in the Aztec natural world are in this play. So it's a hearkening back of a subliminal acknowledgement that we're going to learn a little more about Aztec mythology. And then we do. So what do we have in this myth? What do we have in this myth of the dark root of its scream? We have the earthy with the spiritual, the present with the past, two existences on the same page, at the same time, on the same stage. Let's break those down. First, the earthy with the spiritual. We have the spirituality of the mother and the priest. And then later on in the play, we have the spirituality of what happens when they approach the coffin, what they see coming out of the coffin, and how that becomes related. More about that in a moment. And then the earthy, the three characters on the corner, smoking marijuana, talking about everyday vato loco crazy stuff. We have one character, Gato, who's always looking for trouble, perhaps. Maybe he thinks he's looking for fun and the fun veers into trouble. Why is he perhaps perceived as looking for trouble? I'll let you think about why society might have put him in a place where he is always looking for trouble. But we have Gato, we have Conejo, we have Lizard, very earthy on one side, and the priest, the mother, crying, praying, and the girlfriend Dahlia on the other side. Then we have the present and the past, which is very soon in the play we're going to start hearing the characters talk about Indio, talking about Aztec mythology and the heritage and culture of the Chicano and the Aztec homeland in Mexico. And then we have the present of both the street corner and the family and the Vietnam War. So we have the present, Vietnam War, and the past, Aztec mythology. And then here's something very interesting. We have two existences happening at the same time on the same stage. They're very realistic. We have the family talking with the priest in the church, and then we have the three vato locos, the three pachucos, on the street corner. But it's not having a scene and then having another scene. No. They have two scenes that flip back and forth, and they're on stage. They're not really frozen. They can be portrayed as frozen, but if you look at it, it seems as though there's a bit of a jump in time when they go from the scene on the street corner to the church, and then when they return to the street corner, it seems like there's a bit of a jump in time. Same thing when you go from the church to a street on the street corner, and then back to the church, it seems like there's been a bit of a jump in time, which I would suggest means that the scene continues. So there's two existences happening on the same time. Also, to point this out, there's this. Do you remember? What's the setting for this play? Now, we know going back, we're going to go back a lot as we talk about this play. Going back in the early actos, there was no setting. The back of a flatbed truck, or maybe a open space in the Union Hall or a community center. That was it. No setting. The lights, the sun, or maybe the neon lights of the Union Hall. The costumes were basically what they were wearing. In this one, and it says it very specifically, there's a giant structure set dead center of the set, of the stage. And what is that set piece that dominates? A pyramid. It's not an Egyptian pyramid. Might seem like that to some people, but if you look carefully, there's even a change from the way the pyramid is designed, created, perceived at the bottom, to how it is as it gets closer to the top. It becomes more and more Aztec, perhaps more and more mythic. There are representations of things that the Chicana audience would recognize: a molcajete, a volcanic stone grinding mixing. There are, or could be, Aztec blankets, feathers, other spiritual, cultural heritage artifacts on this pyramid. So we have the present and then we have the past on the stage at the same time as we have two different realities happening at the same time. The church setting and the street corner setting happening at the same time. That's kind of extraordinary, isn't it? And it's a huge jump. Only 2 years since the beginning of El Teatro Campesino and the Actos in 1965. I'll keep reminding you, this was in 1967 in Fresno, California, at a church. So the setting is symbolic, both realistic and non-realistic. There are lights for the first time. Very specifically, it mentions that. And this immediately signifies the lights, the soundscape, the music we might hear, the pyramid, that this is a mythic, indigenous theme. We don't get to that right away, story-wise. However, it's there right from the beginning in the pyramid. So, realistic, non-realistic, symbolic, behavioral, everyday, quotidian. What happens in the play? The two different realities, the two different stages, street corner, church, start to combine. The characters come together. At first, as they get closer, the two scenes and the dialogue in the two scenes starts to overlap, but they're still two different realities. They're not talking to each other. They're talking to the people in their scene, but the dialogue overlaps. A very interesting theatrical device. Then they draw closer, and then they're together. They've commingled. They influence each other. Some of it directly, a priest and these three street corner characters, the mother, saintly, and the girlfriend who we can say has vestiges of purity about her, and yet Gato almost immediately becomes very earthy in his, for lack of a better word, cat-like pursuit, stalking the girlfriend Dahlia. So we have earthy and spiritual at the same time. Rhythmically, I think we can say that the way the dialogue undulates back and forth, the setting going from one to another, the dialogue being separate and then overlapping, and then all being in the same scene. As the mito progresses, it moves like an animal. And what animal might you say moves like that on the ground, back and forth? A serpent, perhaps, some of you might say. Well, if you said that, I agree. Yes, I think we can say that this play undulates back and forth, moves as it progresses like a serpent. And the closer it gets, the more prevalent that serpent symbology becomes noticeable. Two separate scenes overlapping, then finally as one. Why a serpent? Why does it undulate? After all of this talk, after we see the priest arguing with the mother, first we see the three guys on the street corner arguing about Indio. Was he a good guy? Was he an activist? Was he going to come back and help his people? Or was he just a dreamer? If he believed so much in helping his people, why did he go to Vietnam? Why did he support the war? He was just all talk. So we have that, and then the same thing with the priest, talking with the mother and Dahlia about why Indio was doing what he was doing, why he was being a little rebellious, why the priest did not want him to use the church for his community gatherings, even though he does say, well, I considered letting him use the church, but some of the other people in the community didn't want him to be talking about this indigenous heritage, about community activism in the church. And that's very realistic. Don't we now still have all these different levels of how people feel about social and political action and activism in our community? And I don't mean just in our Chicano community. Yes, of course, in our Chicano community, but also in our larger American community, in the larger world community. Isn't there not always love it or leave it, as opposed to change it or lose it? I don't know if all of you or some of you remember a very well-known catchphrase in the 70s, early 80s in the US, America, love it or leave it. And then there was a response from the other side, which was America, change it or lose it. Don't we kind of still see some of that happening? They might be using different words, but that's still happening. Anyway, it's hard for me not to get a little more political as we start talking about these mitos, isn't it? So, they talk about Indio wanting to use the church and the priest saying some people didn't want him to. So even there is an internal conflict. As there was, honestly, Luis deals with this honestly, there was internal conflicts within the Latino Chicano community about activism. We even talked about this way back when we talked about what is a Chicano. After we talked about all the things it was or wasn't, and then the big thing at the end that I say, I believe, it's a political statement. So even in that, even in the use of the term Chicano, there is disagreement to use or not to use. What do you consider yourself if you're Latino? Do you consider yourself a Latino? That's fine. Do you consider yourself a Hispanic? That's okay. Do you call yourself a Mexican American? That's fine. Are you a Chicanx? Great. Whatever you call yourself, it's your right. For myself, I use the term Chicano because it's a political statement. So those discussions are continuing. So we have the symbology getting closer and closer, talking about, yes, he talked about Aztec imagery and the past, and then he went to Vietnam anyway and died. So much for being godlike. The mother, the Dahlia, and the priest arguing about him wanting to be, him becoming perhaps a little more, can we say the word, maybe a little more radical? Or maybe just a little more socially conscious? And the priest going, it got a little too much and people didn't want him to do that. So we have these two conflicting things happening. And then we have, as we get to it, we see that the priest does not seem to be connected to the people that he ministers to. Was that perhaps a statement about the church? And we do know that Luis Valdez was very spiritual. We do know that he has a character of the Quinta Temporada, the fifth season, social justice represented on stage, including people from the church. So he knows that the church was instrumental in the early support of the United Farm Workers. So he doesn't deny that. And he also knows that Mexicanos and Chicanos are very, not all, but a lot of them, dare I say perhaps a majority, are very religious, spiritual, even if not dogmatic. So is that a statement about the church? Perhaps. Or is that a statement about one part of the church? So even in this, even though it's mythic, even though there's magic realism, I think it's a very honest look at Chicano society with the people on the street corner and the mother and Dahlia and the church. So it's mixed, this mito. Realistic depictions of what's happening in the Chicano community, and then this mythological action that we're getting closer and closer to. So, what does the mother see after everyone is in the room together at the church, at the wake, talking about Johnny, with Gato trying to sneak up cat-like onto Dahlia. What's that on the floor? What's that stain? Did you read? That's right, it was blood. Why blood? Do we know? Did you really know? Some of you who know a little bit about Aztec mythology, or some of you who know a little more about theatrical devices, or some of you who are just smart and got it, when you saw that there was a stain and the color of the stain, you might have started to jump ahead. Some of you maybe didn't. Maybe it was like, well, what is that stain? Why are they talking about that? Why, when the mother picks up her hand, is her hand stained red? Whether you knew then, whether you guessed before we even got there, or whether it took you a while to realize until they say what it is, it's blood. What is blood symbolic of? Well, obviously, it can be symbolic of injury, death. Blood is also life-giving. It's what pumps the oxygen that goes from our nose to our lungs to our whole body. So blood is also life-giving. So from the coffin where Indio's body is, covered with a flag, we see blood. The mother sees it. The priest says, oh, it's not that. They try to clean it up. And then what happens? Everyone is there in the room. We know that before he went, Indio talked about doing something and keeping Chicanos from going to the war. And then he went himself. Contradictory? Perhaps. We know, they talk a little bit about this in the play, that Indio talked about Quetzalcoatl, him wanting to end the blood sacrifice of the Aztec, the blood sacrifice where they opened the living victim's chest and pulled out his perhaps still beating heart and offered it to the sun god, Huitzilopochtli. We know that Quetzalcoatl, feathered serpent, Quetzal, bird, plumed bird, long, beautiful bird with long green feathers, that if you see really beautiful traditional Aztec headdresses, not all, but the ones that are green are, if not actual Quetzal feathers, because there are probably not that many left, they're meant to symbolize Quetzal feathers. Quetzal, bird, Coatl, serpent, plumed serpent, feathered serpent. Quetzalcoatl wanted to end a blood sacrifice. Quetzalcoatl is also, in some people's, if we want to look for a relationship, or how would you compare it to Judeo-Christian mythology? You can say that the fact that he was trying to do good, the fact that he wanted to end sacrifice the way Jesus Christ wanted to get the moneylenders out of the temple, that there might have been a connection between Quetzalcoatl, how he was perceived, and how Jesus Christ might be perceived. We also know that Indio wanted to stop Chicanos from going to Vietnam and being sacrificed on the altar of this military conflict. So there's a lot of this duo imagery, mirror imagery. We also hear and know that what happened to Quetzalcoatl was that he himself, who wanted to stop the sacrifices, was sacrificed. And part of that was due with him being forced to see his own image in the mirror and being shamed of his self-image. Very interesting mythology for Chicanos in the late 60s. So, This whole concept, this whole symbolism of mirror imagery, of Quetzalcoatl seeing himself, mirror imagery, is also prevalent in the whole play. The two realities, street corner and church, mirroring each other. The reality and the mythic mirroring each other. So all of these themes continue to circle each other and to reinforce each other. So then what happens? There is a argument between Lizard, Gato, and the priest. And what happens? Lizard attacks, certainly threatens the priest. The priest gets scared and he runs off. Lizard chases him. And what happens later? Lizard comes back. He has stripped him of his vestments, of his costume, stripped the priest Lizard has of his costumes, and comes back dressed like the priest. Perhaps the way when they were sacrificing the victims to the sun god, they stripped what they were wearing so they could get to the heart, opened the chest, stripped him of his humanity, and in a way turned him from being human to being something divine, a sacrifice. Does that sound odd? How can you die and be divine? How can you be sacrificed and be divine? Well, I'd ask you just to consider Judeo-Christian mythology. Does not Jesus Christ die? Does he die for his sins, or does he die for the sins of the people that he is trying to help? According to the New Testament, he dies to wash away the sin of the original sin. So anyway, so again, this mirror imagery in this play of having Quetzalcoatl die to end the suffering of the other people who were sacrificed. Then we have the mirror imagery of all these different realities happening on the same. And then what happens when Lizard comes back like the priest? The Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ, does it symbolize Christ's death? Perhaps. But I would think most people would say that symbolizes the everlasting life of Christianity. Interesting. So, Quetzalcoatl's heart might signify what after he dies? I don't know, different images, different myths. Does it say that his heart was plucked from him? Not necessarily that, but he does die. He was sacrificed. So his heart signifies the everlasting life of, in this play, might it perhaps signify what? What happens at the end? They see the blood. They try to clean up the blood. They open the coffin. They reach in. They see this feathered headdress. The priest puts it on. Now he's a priest with a feathered headdress. So again, there's a mixture of the cultures happening. And then what does he do? He reaches in. It's pretty fascinating, isn't it? He reaches and pulls out. And then we see the mother say in a scream, the dark root of a scream. The mother says what it is. She tells us it's Indio's heart. And that's the last image of the play. A priest modern day priests with this headdress presented like an image of the mythology of the Aztec priest holding up a beating heart. Right? How do we know it's beating? Perhaps something in the drums that we're starting to hear, perhaps in the light, but we know that there is blood that's seeping out. And the body's been shipped from Vietnam, so it's been dead a long while. I doubt there was a lot of blood. There was probably in a body bag in there anyway, or something. But we see the symbolism of the blood seeping out, and then we see the symbolism of the, I would venture to suggest, the still bleeding heart being held up, and then it's underlined by the mother's cry, it's Indio's heart. So, and you don't have to go here with me. You can disagree. That's absolutely okay. I hope once in a while you do disagree with me so that it makes you think. As I said earlier, this whole class is just about making us think about identity, making us think about art, like theater, like we're talking right now, all the symbolism, and making us think about activism. The activism that Indio represents, the activism of trying to prevent Chicanos or dissuade Chicanos in the 1960s from going to be sacrificed on the altar of the war in Vietnam. So the heart, so if you question me, it's good. I really mean that sincerely. Just go deeper and come up with an answer for yourself. And if your answer is different from mine, but it came from a conversation that we're having together, as you talking back to the screen, maybe yelling at me once in a while, right on. Anyway, so the heart, bleeding heart. The Sacred Heart of Christ, everlasting life, Christianity, beating heart of Indio, of Quetzalcoatl, maybe the everlasting life of Chicanos, Chicanas, Chicanx, the cosmic race, la raza cósmica. What does the title mean, the dark root of a scream? And where does it come from? It's one of the last lines, it might even be the last line of one of the greatest plays ever written, and it's not in English, by one of the, I would say, top 5 playwrights in the world canon. Top 10 if you include non-Eurocentric, because I'm talking about world canon, wrong term. In the Eurocentric canon, one of the top 5 playwrights, Federico Garcia Lorca. One of his most famous plays, Boda de Sangre, Blood Wedding. In Blood Wedding, one of the last lines that the mother has as she holds up the knife that killed her son says, basically, all we have left, and now I'm just throwing in with her subtext, all we have left after all this misery, all this violence that just keeps being permeated and going back and forth and continuing, all we have left is a dark root of a scream. So, Luis Valdez talking about Chicano theater does refer back to Spanish theater, one of the greats. Last thing I want to say about Bernabe, and then I'm going to give you a bit of a break. In your opinion, does Dark Root of a Scream use current events, the war, to explore the mythic past of the Aztecs? Or does it explore the mythical past, the sacrifice of Quetzalcoatl, human sacrifice, to make that contemporary Chicano audience in 1967 think about the war in Vietnam and activism and how do we move forward? Can it be both? So in this one play, in this first 1967 prototype, first prototype of the mito, performed in a church with different realities, I think we can say it explores both. How the present is dependent on and affected by the past, and also how the past can help us think about, remember, and move forward into the present and the future. Mito. Remembering the past to deal with the present and to move forward into the future. The mito as a continuing growth and evolution of Chicano theater. Dark Root of a Scream, the first and the prototype of the mito. We're going to listen to some music, take a little break. When we come back, we'll talk about the second play that we're going to discuss today, and that play is Bernabe. If you haven't read it yet, and if this that we've talked about today interests you, this use of mythology, which is going to be similar but different in the next play, then before you come back to the next lecture, read the play. Thank you so much. See you soon, and cue music.